George Washington Part 1, From Plantation Boy to Provincial Officer, where he's 1732-1754. Chapter 1, A Virginian by Birth. Their birth, family, and early environment. George Washington was born on February 22, 1732, in Westmoreland County in the Tidewater region of colonial Virginia, a British possession along the Atlantic seaboard of North America. He entered the world not as a poor commoner and not as a great aristocrat, but as the son of a middling planter family that owned land and enslaved laborers, placing him in the broad middle ranks of Virginia's gentry. This environment, shaped by tobacco agriculture, the Anglican Church, and a rigid social hierarchy, formed the backdrop of his early years and planted many of the ideas and habits that would later influence his leadership. His father, Augustine Washington, had been born into modest circumstances for a planter, but gradually improved his position through marriage, land acquisition, and business ventures. Augustine owned several plantations and engaged in ironworks and other enterprises, reflecting the entrepreneurial spirit of many colonial landowners who sought to diversify beyond tobacco when possible. His mother, Mary Ball Washington, came from a family of some standing but without great wealth. Their marriage united two respectable but not top-tier families within Virginia's stratified society, giving George a background that combined aspiration with a need for advancement through effort. In the 1730s and 1740s, Virginia was a slave society, and the Washington household was no exception. Enslaved Africans and African Americans worked the fields, maintained the homes, and contributed to the family's fortunes. As a child, George grew up surrounded by this system, seeing enslaved people as part of the daily fabric of plantation life. It was an arrangement accepted and rarely questioned in his world, even though it stood in tension with later ideals of liberty and equality that he would champion in the Revolutionary era. Washington's early years involved several moves that reflected his father's land holdings and ambitions. He was born at Pope's Creek, also known as Wakefield, but the family later relocated to a property near the Rappahannock River outside Fredericksburg, often referred to as Ferry Farm. These moves exposed him to different parts of Virginia's landscape and economy. Riverfront plantations tied to Atlantic trade, small local communities, and the rhythms of tobacco cultivation and export. The young Washington thus experienced Virginia as a network of plantations, waterways, and emerging towns, all tied into the broader British Empire. In 1743, when George was about 11, Augustine Washington died, leaving Mary Ball Washington a widow with several children. This event significantly affected George's path. Augustine's death meant that the family's properties were divided among his children from two marriages, with the eldest son from the first marriage inheriting the main estate at what would later be Mount Vernon. George received a smaller inheritance, land and some enslaved people, but not the principal family seat. This inheritance pattern, common in Virginia, both constrained and motivated him. He was not destitute, but he also was not fully established. He would need to rely on his own efforts, connections, and talents to rise. Mary Washington's strong-willed nature and protective approach to her children influenced George's discipline and sense of duty. She managed Ferry Farm and kept close control over finances, which sometimes frustrated her ambitious son, who yearned for opportunities beyond the farm. Nonetheless, the combination of moderate means, exposure to plantation management, and a network of relatives and neighbors in the gentry placed George Washington in a position to seek advancement in a society that rewarded land, honor, and service. Chapter 2, Learning the Measure of Land, education, character, and surveying. Unlike some of his later compatriots, such as John Adams or Thomas Jefferson, George Washington did not receive a classical education or attend college. His schooling was relatively brief and practical, focusing on basic literacy, arithmetic, and business skills. Yet he displayed a serious and self-directed approach to learning, reflecting an early understanding that self-discipline could compensate for limited formal education. As a youth, Washington copied and studied a collection of rules of civility and decent behavior, which offered guidance on manners, self-control, and social interaction. This exercise was more than rote writing. It became part of his lifelong effort to cultivate a composed, courteous, and dignified public persona. He learned to listen more than he spoke in large gatherings, to control his temper, and to conduct himself in a way that earned respect. These habits would later define his leadership style, where he often communicated more through presence and example than through elaborate speeches. Mathematics and geometry, which he absorbed in his youth, proved valuable when he pursued surveying. The profession of surveying had practical importance in a colony where land speculation and westward expansion were constant concerns. Through family connections, including the powerful Fairfax family, Washington obtained opportunities as a young surveyor in the Shenandoah Valley and along Virginia's frontier. In his mid-teens, he joined expeditions to map and measure lands beyond the settled Tidewater region, often enduring rugged conditions, simple lodgings, and exposure to the elements. This surveying work shaped Washington in several ways. First, it honed technical skills. He learned to use compasses, chains, and other instruments with precision. Second, it gave him an intimate understanding of the American landscape, rivers, mountains, forests, and routes. That would later be crucial in military planning. Third, it exposed him directly to the tensions and opportunities of the frontier, where indigenous nations, colonial settlers, and land companies all had competing claims. On these journeys, Washington interacted with indigenous peoples, traders, and frontier settlers. And he witnessed both the possibilities of land and the conflicts over who would control it. From an early American perspective, land represented wealth, status, and security. Washington's experiences confirmed that those who understood and controlled land would shape the future of the colonies. He began to invest in land himself, building a personal stake in the westward movement that would later intersect with imperial rivalries between Britain and France. The work also taught him resilience and resourcefulness. Nights spent in makeshift shelters, dealing with weather, illness, and the uncertainties of travel, toughened him physically and mentally. Washington developed a capacity to endure hardship without complaint, a trait that would become legendary during later campaigns in the Revolutionary War. He also gained confidence in his ability to manage men and projects, as he sometimes led small surveying parties and coordinated logistics. By his late teens, Washington was emerging as a young man with a mix of practicality and ambition. While he lacked the polish and education of some older Virginia gentlemen, he compensated with industry, reliability, and a growing reputation for competence. Surveying had given him a firm foundation in land, leadership, and self-sufficiency, skills that prepared him for the next phase of his life as a provincial officer and participant in imperial conflict. Chapter 3. An ambitious young Virginian, social aspirations and first steps into public life. In mid-18th century Virginia, social status was based on a combination of birth, land ownership, wealth, and personal conduct. George Washington understood this hierarchy keenly and sought to climb within it. His early interactions with the Fairfax family, particularly Lord Fairfax and his relatives, who owned extensive lands near Mount Vernon, provided him with models of aristocratic lifestyle as well as valuable patronage. The Fairfaxes saw promise in the serious, capable young man and helped open doors for him. Washington carefully cultivated the appearance of a gentleman. He paid attention to dress, posture, and conversation, learning to move comfortably in elite circles even as he remained aware of his relatively modest beginnings. He kept accounts and correspondence in a meticulous hand, building a reputation for orderliness and trustworthiness. He also practiced riding and hunting, skills prized among Virginia's gentry and later essential for a military commander. Despite his ambitions, Washington's path was not guaranteed. His inheritance, while not negligible, did not secure the kind of independent fortune that some of his peers possessed. To advance, he would need both service and opportunity. The Virginia militia offered one such avenue. Militia service was simultaneously a duty and a chance for recognition. Officers could display bravery, leadership, and loyalty, winning the respect of their community and potentially earning royal commissions. When the colonial government in Williamsburg sought to strengthen its defenses and assert claims in the Ohio Valley, Washington was well positioned to volunteer. His surveying experience, knowledge of the frontier, and connections with influential families made him an attractive candidate. He began receiving militia appointments in the early 1750s, first at lesser ranks and then with increasing responsibility. At the same time, Washington was beginning to participate more in public affairs. He observed debates over land policy, defense, and relations with indigenous nations. Though still young, he had developed a sense of himself as someone who could contribute to Virginia's security and prosperity. His ambition was not purely personal. It was intertwined with a belief in the colony's rights and its role within the British Empire. Yet, Washington remained conscious of the need to prove himself. He carefully recorded his activities and sought to present them in a favorable light to superiors and potential patrons. He knew that success in military ventures, especially on the contested frontier, could propel him forward. The stage was set for him to step into a larger role as tensions between Britain and France in North America escalated. Chapter 4, The Edge of Empire, The Road to the 7 Years' War. By the early 1750s, the Ohio Valley and surrounding regions had become a focal point of imperial rivalry. Both Britain and France laid claim to the territory, while indigenous nations, including the Iroquois and various Ohio Valley tribes, pursued their own interests and alliances. Land companies backed by Virginia interests, such as the Ohio Company, sought to survey and settle lands west of the Appalachians, envisioning profitable expansion. The French responded by building a chain of forts from the Great Lakes down toward the Ohio River, aiming to link their holdings in Canada with those along the Mississippi. British officials in Virginia and London interpreted this move as a direct challenge to their chartered claims and future expansion. A clash seemed increasingly likely, even if no one yet anticipated the global scale of the eventual conflict, known in Europe as the 7 Years' War, would reach. In this fraught context, the governor of Virginia, Robert Dinwiddie, decided to send a diplomatic mission to warn the French to withdraw from what Britain considered its territory. In late 1753, he selected George Washington, then about 21 years old, to carry his letter to French commanders in the Ohio region. This assignment placed Washington at the heart of imperial maneuvering and demonstrated the confidence colonial authorities had begun to place in him. The journey was arduous. Washington traveled hundreds of miles through wilderness, accompanied by a small party that included a guide and an interpreter. He crossed rivers, braved harsh winter conditions, and navigated territories where alliances and tensions were complex. He met with indigenous leaders to assess their positions and seek support, learning firsthand about the diplomatic landscape beyond the settled colonies. Upon reaching the French outposts, Washington delivered Dinwiddie's message and received a polite but firm reply. The French intended to remain and build additional fortifications. Washington's detailed journal of the mission, later published, provided valuable intelligence on French strength and positions, as well as an account that burnished his own reputation as a capable and courageous agent of the colony. The failure of diplomacy only heightened tensions. In early 1754, as the French moved to solidify their position at a strategic site where the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers meet to form the Ohio, future Pittsburgh, Dinwiddie authorized a military expedition to assert British claims. Washington, now appointed a lieutenant colonel in the Virginia militia, was tasked with leading advance forces into the contested area. This assignment marked a clear transition in Washington's life, from surveyor, ambitious young planter, and militia officer to central actor in the opening phases of a war that would soon engulf much of the world. As he marched into the Ohio country, he was stepping onto the edge of empire, where his actions would have consequences far beyond his own career. The episodes that followed, including the skirmish at Jumonville Glen and the construction and surrender of Fort Necessity, would serve as a harsh initiation into the realities of war and leadership, and they would begin to shape how Americans and Britons alike viewed this young Virginian. Washington stands on the verge of his first major military test. His upbringing in colonial Virginia, his practical education and surveying experience, and his carefully cultivated ambitions have prepared him to seize opportunities and endure hardship. The coming conflict in the Ohio Valley will test those qualities severely and begin the process of transforming him from a provincial officer into a figure of imperial and eventually national significance. Do not use any music for this video. George Washington, Part 2, Soldier of Empire and Father of His Country, 1754-1883. Chapter 5, Trial by Fire, 7 Years' War and Military Apprenticeship. George Washington's first real test as a military leader came in 1754 when he marched into the Ohio country at the head of a small Virginia force. The mission, authorized by Governor Robert Dinwiddie, aimed to assert British claims and, if possible, block the French from strengthening their position at the forks of the Ohio. Washington, only in his early 20s, was now a lieutenant colonel whose actions would carry consequences far beyond what he or his superiors fully anticipated. In late May 1754, Washington's scouting parties learned that a French detachment was nearby. Acting on this intelligence, he led a surprise attack at a place that became known as Jumonville Glen. The skirmish was brief but bloody. Several Frenchmen were killed, including the officer in command, Ensign Jumonville, and others were captured. The circumstances of Jumonville's death, whether he was killed in battle or after attempting to deliver a diplomatic summons, would be hotly debated and used by the French to accuse the British of ambush and murder. For Washington, it was a shock. His first engagement had ignited a wider conflict rather than merely enforcing Virginia's claims. Realizing that French retaliation was likely, Washington hastily constructed a small defensive position he named Fort Necessity in a low-lying meadow at Great Meadows. The fort's location and design were far from ideal. It was exposed and vulnerable to attack from higher ground and heavy rain. In early July, a larger French and indigenous force descended on Fort Necessity. After hours of fighting in pouring rain, with ammunition wet and casualties mounting, Washington agreed to surrender terms. The capitulation document, drafted in French, included language suggesting that he admitted to assassinating Jumonville, phrasing he later claimed not to have fully understood. The defeat at Fort Necessity was a humiliating baptism by fire. Yet from Washington's perspective, it also provided hard-earned lessons. He saw the importance of terrain, fortification, supply, and clear communication. He experienced firsthand the complexities of coordinating with indigenous allies and interpreting their motives, and he realized that his own judgment, while bold, needed tempering with greater caution and experience. Despite this setback, Washington's military career did not end. When British General Edward Braddock arrived in 1755 to lead a major expedition against the French, Washington volunteered to serve as an aide-de-camp. Although he did not receive the royal commission he desired, working closely with Braddock offered another opportunity to learn European-style warfare from a professional officer. Braddock's expedition, however, revealed stark contrasts between European tactics and American conditions. The army moved slowly through the wilderness, cutting roads and adhering to rigid formations. Washington and other colonial officers warned that such methods made the column vulnerable to ambush in dense forests. Their concerns proved tragically prescient at the Battle of the Monongahela, when French and indigenous forces attacked the extended British line. Confusion and panic swept through the ranks as red-coated soldiers, unaccustomed to fighting without clear formations, suffered heavy casualties. Amid the chaos, Washington displayed composure. He rode back and forth, carrying orders and trying to rally retreating troops, even as bullets tore through his coat and killed horses beneath him. His efforts helped organize a rearguard that allowed remnants of the force to withdraw. Braddock was mortally wounded, and the expedition ended in disaster. In the aftermath, see stories of Washington's bravery, how he seemed miraculously unharmed despite enemy fire, circulated widely in the colonies. These tales added to his growing reputation. More importantly, the experience reinforced his conviction that tactics must adapt to local conditions, and that overconfidence in European methods could be fatal in America's forests and hills. The 7 Years' War continued, and Washington remained involved in frontier defense, and later in successful operations against French strongholds, including the eventual capture of Fort Duquesne, rebuilt by the British as Fort Pitt. He gained further experience in organizing campaigns, training militia, and dealing with colonial politics and British command structures. Yet he also accumulated frustrations. Colonial officers were often denied equal rank and pay with British regulars. Their commissions didn't carry the same honor. Washington's attempts to obtain a royal commission failed, leaving him resentful of perceived slights and more aware of the unequal relationship between metropole and colony. By the war's end, Washington had emerged as one of Virginia's most experienced military figures, but he was also ready to step away from active service. His health had suffered, and the limits imposed on colonial officers convinced him that further advancement in the British Army was unlikely. He resigned his commission and returned to civilian life, bringing with him a store of knowledge about war and leadership that would prove invaluable in the Revolutionary era. Upon leaving military service, Washington turned his attention to building a stable and prestigious civilian life. In 1759, he married Martha Dandridge Custis, a wealthy widow with 2 young children. Martha brought substantial property and enslaved workers to the marriage, greatly increasing Washington's wealth and responsibilities. Their union was by all accounts affectionate and respectful, though also shaped by the practical considerations of status and estate management that guided many elite colonial marriages. The couple settled at Mount Vernon, the plantation on the Potomac River that Washington would expand and refine over the years. He devoted himself to improving the estate's productivity, and appearance. Moving away from exclusive reliance on tobacco, he experimented with crop rotation, wheat, and other ventures, reflecting both soil exhaustion and a desire to diversify income. He invested in mills, fisheries, and other enterprises, demonstrating an entrepreneurial streak. Managing Mount Vernon meant overseeing enslaved laborers, hired workers, and tenants. Washington's daily life involved detailed supervision, keeping accounts, directing planning and harvest cycles, and planning construction and maintenance. He rose early, rode the property, and maintained voluminous records. His approach was practical and empirical, influenced by agricultural manuals and correspondence with other planners. He was always looking for more efficient methods. At the same time, Washington began to establish himself as a political figure. He served in the Virginia House of Burgesses, the colonial legislature, representing his local county. In this role, he observed debates over taxation, defense, and westward expansion. Initially quiet in legislative sessions, he preferred to work behind the scenes, building relationships and establishing a reputation for seriousness and integrity rather than oratory. Socially, Washington and his wife hosted guests, participated in the social circuits of Virginia's gentry, and occasionally traveled to Williamsburg, the colonial capital. These activities reinforced his public profile and connected him to influential networks. Over time, he became known not only as a former military officer and successful planner, but also as a reliable representative of his region's interests. The period between the end of the 7 Years' War and the onset of the imperial crisis in the 1760s was thus a time of consolidation for Washington. He refined his estate, strengthened his social standing, and gained experience in colonial self-government. Yet events beyond his control were brewing that would draw him back into the realm of high politics and conflict. The conclusion of the 7 Years' War left Britain with a vast empire, but also with significant debts and security challenges. Seeking revenue and greater control over the colonies, Parliament passed measures such as the Sugar Act, Stamp Act, and later the Townshend Duties. These policies sought to tax colonial trade and legal transactions, asserting Parliament's authority over the colonies in new ways. From Washington's perspective, as a Virginia planner and legislator, these changes were unsettling. While he initially expressed loyalty to the crown and to the idea of a unified empire, he shared his fellow colonists' concern that taxation without colonial representation in Parliament violated traditional English rights. He worried that if unchecked, such measures could extend to property and self-government in ways that undermined the autonomy Virginians valued. Washington supported non-importation agreements and other forms of economic protest, aligning himself with leading patriot figures in Virginia. He increasingly framed the dispute as one about constitutional rights rather than mere financial burdens. At the same time, British restrictions on Western settlement, such as the Proclamation of 1763, clashed with his interests as a land speculator and advocate of frontier expansion. He saw these limits as unfair constraints on colonial opportunity. As tensions escalated in the 1770s, particularly after the Boston Tea Party and the Coercive Acts, Washington's stance hardened. He viewed the punitive actions against Massachusetts as an attack on colonial liberties more broadly. Within Virginia, he participated in conventions that coordinated protest and prepared for possible conflict. The language of rights, liberties, and resistance to arbitrary power resonated with his own experiences of being treated as a lesser partner within the empire. Washington assumed command of the Continental Army outside Boston in July 1775. He found an enthusiastic but disorganized force, militia units from different colonies, unevenly equipped and trained with varying levels of discipline. The challenge was to turn this collection of volunteers into a functioning army capable of facing one of the world's most powerful military establishments. His first campaign achieved a notable success. Through a patient siege and clever use of artillery placed on Dorchester Heights, Washington compelled the British to evacuate Boston in March 1776. This victory boosted American morale and seemed to validate his leadership. But the war's course soon grew far more difficult. In the summer and fall of 1776, British forces launched a massive offensive against New York. Washington's army suffered a series of defeats on Long Island and Manhattan, forced into retreat under pressure from superior numbers and naval power. The losses exposed shortcomings in American training, organization, and command. Washington himself made missteps, including overcommitting to holding certain positions and underestimating British maneuver capabilities. By late 1776, the Continental Army had retreated across New Jersey into Pennsylvania. Desertions increased, supplies dwindled, and the cause appeared in jeopardy. Yet, Washington refused to concede defeat. In a daring move at the end of December, he led his troops across the ice-choked Delaware River at night to surprise Hessian forces at Trenton. The victory, followed by another engagement at Princeton, revived Patriot morale and demonstrated that the American army could strike effectively even after setbacks. Over the next several years, Washington's strategic approach matured. He recognized that trying to win the war through large, decisive battles against a stronger foe was less important than keeping his army intact and prolonging the conflict until political and international factors shifted in America's favor. He often chose to avoid unnecessary risks, trading ground for time when needed. This patience sometimes frustrated contemporaries who desired more aggressive action, but it ultimately helped preserve the Continental Army as a symbol and instrument of resistance. The winter encampment at Valley Forge in 1777-1778 became emblematic of the Army's resilience. Enduring shortages of food, clothing, and shelter, Washington's troops suffered terribly. Yet under his leadership and with the crucial training regimen introduced by Baron Friedrich von Steuben, the army emerged more disciplined and capable. Washington used this period not only to maintain morale, but also to advocate with Congress and state governments for better supply systems and stronger central coordination. Politically, Washington navigated internal challenges as well. Some officers and politicians, dissatisfied with the pace of victory, flirted with the idea of replacing him with a more aggressive commander. The so-called Conway Cabal, a loose collection of critics, briefly threatened his position. Washington responded with calm dignity, avoiding open confrontation, but making clear to key supporters his awareness of the intrigues. His steady behavior, combined with loyalty from influential figures and the lack of a clearly superior alternative, allowed him to retain command. As the war progressed, Washington's role increasingly involved coordination with allies. The French alliance after 1778 brought naval and ground forces that altered the strategic balance. Working with French commanders, Washington planned operations that culminated in the Yorktown campaign. In 1781, he seized the opportunity when British General Cornwallis entrenched his forces at Yorktown, Virginia. Moving his army south and cooperating with a French fleet that blocked British escape by sea, Washington oversaw the siege that forced Cornwallis's surrender. Yorktown did not immediately end the war, but it effectively broke British political will to continue large-scale operations. For Washington, it vindicated years of perseverance, adapting strategy, and holding the army together under harsh conditions. He became widely seen, both in America and abroad, as the central figure in the American struggle for independence. Perhaps equally important was what Washington chose not to do at the war's end. As victory approached, some officers, frustrated by unpaid wages and uncertain about the new nation's stability, murmured about using the Army's power to secure their demands. In the Newburgh Conspiracy of 1783, Washington confronted this unrest directly. appealing to officers' sense of honor and sacrifice. In a famous moment, he donned spectacles and remarked on his own aging in service of the cause, moving many to tears and diffusing the crisis. Shortly thereafter, Washington resigned his commission and returned control of the army to civilian authorities. This act, rare in history, impressed observers as a powerful statement of Republican principle. The general who could have seized power instead relinquished it. From the American perspective, Washington's decision confirmed his status not only as a successful military leader, but as a guardian of the ideals for which the Revolution had been fought. By 1783, Washington had completed an extraordinary transformation. He had entered the 7 Years' War as an ambitious young provincial officer seeking advancement within the British Empire. He emerged from the Revolutionary War as the foremost figure in an independent United States, revered for his leadership, restraint, and dedication to the new republic. The next phase of his life would require a different kind of service, helping to design and lead a national government capable of sustaining the independence he had helped win. George Washington, Part 3, Inventing the Presidency and Guarding the Republic, 1783-1799, Chapter 9, A Farmer Once More, returned to Mount Vernon and the constitutional crisis. When George Washington resigned his commission in December 1783 and returned to Mount Vernon, he hoped that his days of public service were largely behind him. In a gesture widely praised at home and abroad, he had relinquished military power and embraced the role of private citizen and farmer. To many Americans, this act confirmed that the new republic would not follow the path of so many revolutions that ended in dictatorship. To Washington himself, it was a long-awaited opportunity to devote his energies to his estate, his family, and the quieter responsibilities of civilian life. Back at Mount Vernon, Washington immersed himself in the details of plantation management. He resumed his experiments with crop rotation and diversified agriculture, shifting away from tobacco and expanding wheat production, milling, and other ventures. He introduced new tools, adjusted field layouts, and recorded yields with meticulous care. As before, he supervised enslaved laborers and craftsmen, inspecting work, planning improvements, and trying to maximize productivity. These years deepened his identity as a practical man of the land, aware of both the promise and fragility of American agriculture. Yet even as Washington focused on his estate, his correspondents and visitors kept him fully informed about the young republic's troubles. The Articles of Confederation, which loosely bound the states, created a weak central government with limited authority and no reliable revenue. Congress struggled to pay debts from the Revolutionary War, regulate trade, or address interstate disputes. Individual states pursued conflicting economic policies, issued their own currencies, and sometimes defied national agreements. Events like Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, an uprising of indebted farmers protesting taxes and foreclosures, deeply disturbed Washington. He saw in such unrest a warning that the Revolution's gains could unravel if the government lacked strength and legitimacy. What had been won at great cost could be lost through disunity, economic instability, and factionalism. In letters to former comrades and political leaders, he expressed growing concern that something must be done to strengthen the Union. Calls for reform culminated in the proposal for a convention to revise the Articles. Initially reluctant to re-enter public life, Washington was persuaded that his presence was essential to the convention's success. Friends argued that his reputation for integrity and impartiality could help unify delegates and reassure the public that any proposed changes were not a plot to impose tyranny. After some hesitation and assurances that he would not be expected to play a partisan role, Washington agreed to attend the convention in Philadelphia in 1787. At the Constitutional Convention, Washington was unanimously chosen as presiding officer. He rarely spoke during debates, choosing instead to guide proceedings through his demeanor and judgment. His presence encouraged delegates to remain serious and focused and to compromise when necessary. Many participants later noted that Washington's involvement lent the entire effort legitimacy. Without him, the Constitution might have faced greater skepticism or failed altogether. The Constitution that emerged from the convention created a stronger federal government with an executive, a bicameral legislature, and an independent judiciary. It reflected compromises between large and small states, slaveholding and non-slaveholding regions, and advocates of strong central power versus those favoring state autonomy. Public debate over ratification was intense, but for many Americans, the expectation that Washington would serve as the first president eased fears. They trusted that he would not abuse power and that his leadership would help the new system take root. Thus, Washington's attempted return to a purely private life proved temporary. The nation's difficulties and his own sense of duty drew him back into public service. The farmer of Mount Vernon would once again become a national leader, this time not as a general, but as the first chief executive of the United States. Chapter 10, First in War, First in Peace. The First Presidency and Building a Government. In 1789, Washington was unanimously elected as the first president of the United States, a reflection of the extraordinary trust he commanded. He approached the office with a mixture of reluctance and resolve. Aware that every action he took would set a precedent, he was determined to shape the presidency in a way that combined sufficient authority with Republican restraint. He rejected monarchical trappings, insisting that he be addressed simply as president rather than elaborate honorifics, and balanced dignity with accessibility. From the outset, Washington faced the practical task of turning constitutional language into working institutions. The Constitution created the framework but not the details of executive departments, judicial structures, and administrative procedures. With the support of Congress, Washington oversaw the creation of key departments, state, treasury, war, and appointed capable leaders to head them. His choices reflected both talent and political balance. Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Knox at War, and Edmund Randolph as Attorney General. These men formed the President's Cabinet, an institution not explicitly mentioned in the Constitution, but established by Washington's practice. He convened them to seek advice, debate policies, and coordinate government actions. In doing so, he set a pattern of executive decision-making that future presidents would follow and adapt. One of the most pressing challenges facing the new government was financial. The United States carried significant debt from the Revolution, owed to both domestic and foreign creditors. Hamilton proposed a comprehensive financial program, the federal assumption of state debts, creation of a national bank, and measures to establish good credit and encourage manufacturing. Washington carefully weighed Hamilton's proposals, considering objections from some who feared centralized financial power, and ultimately endorsed the core components. The implementation of Hamilton's plan helped stabilize the nation's finances, signaled that the federal government honored its obligations, and laid foundations for economic growth. However, it also contributed to emerging political divisions. Jefferson and James Madison worried that Hamilton's vision favored commercial and urban interests over agrarian ones, and that a national bank stretched constitutional authority. Washington became the arbiter in these disputes, often siding with Hamilton, but trying to maintain a posture above party lines. Domestically, Washington's administration also confronted questions of federal authority and popular resistance. The most significant early test was the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794, in which farmers in western Pennsylvania protested a federal excise tax on distilled spirits. Many saw the tax as unfair and reminiscent of British policies they had opposed before the Revolution. As protests escalated into intimidation and violence against tax collectors, Washington decided that the new government must assert its right to enforce laws. Invoking the Militia Act, he called up a force of state militia and, in a powerful symbolic gesture, personally reviewed the troops as they marched west, although he did not lead them into the field. The show of force, combined with efforts at negotiation, dispersed the rebellion with little bloodshed. For Washington and many contemporaries, this episode demonstrated that the federal government had both the will and the means to maintain order, while also showing restraint by not imposing excessive punishment. During his presidency, Washington also dealt with issues related to Western expansion and relations with indigenous nations. Treaties, boundary disputes, and conflict on the frontier posed ongoing challenges. Washington supported efforts to regularize relations and define borders, though policies often favored settler expansion at the expense of indigenous communities, reflecting broader patterns in American history. Throughout these domestic initiatives, Washington was mindful of his role as a model. He traveled to different regions, visiting New England and southern states to promote national unity and show that the federal government belonged to all citizens, not just those near the capital. His demeanor, formal but approachable, reserved yet attentive, helped imbue the presidency with an aura of stability and impartiality. By the mid-1790s, the basic structures of the U.S. government were in place, and Washington's leadership had provided continuity and legitimacy. Yet new challenges, particularly in foreign policy and partisan politics, tested his vision of a unified republic. Chapter 11: Neutral Paths and Partisan Storms. Foreign Policy, Parties, and Farewell. Foreign policy loomed large during Washington's presidency. The French Revolution, which began as a quest for liberty and reform, soon plunged Europe into war. Britain and France, the two great powers that had shaped American colonial history, now clashed again. Their conflict put immense pressure on the United States, whose economy and security were intertwined with transatlantic trade. Many Americans initially sympathized with revolutionary France, seeing parallels with their own struggle for independence. Others worried about the excesses and violence of the French Revolution and favored closer ties with Britain. Washington's challenge was to navigate these passions while protecting American interests and avoiding entanglement in European wars. In 1793, Washington issued a proclamation of neutrality, declaring that the United States would remain impartial in the conflict between France and its enemies. He believed that the young nation was too fragile to risk war, and that preserving peace was essential for consolidating independence and economic development. Neutrality did not mean indifference. It meant asserting the right to trade with all sides while staying out of military alliances. The neutrality policy, however, was controversial. French envoy Edmond Charles Genet, Citizen Genet, attempted to enlist American support and privateers for the French cause, appealing directly to public opinion and bypassing the administration. Washington and his cabinet demanded his recall, asserting the government's authority over foreign relations. This affair highlighted both the volatility of public sentiment and the necessity, in Washington's view, of disciplined diplomacy. Relations with Britain remained strained due to unresolved issues from the Revolutionary War and British interference with American shipping. To avoid conflict, Washington sent Chief Justice John Jay to London to negotiate a treaty. The resulting Jay Treaty, signed in 1794, secured British withdrawal from some Western forts and provided mechanisms to address debts and trade disputes. But it did not fully resolve all grievances and was seen by critics as too conciliatory. Domestically, the treaty provoked fierce debate. Supporters argued that it preserved peace and stabilized commerce. Opponents claimed it favored Britain over France and betrayed Republican principles. The controversy over Jay's treaty deepened political divisions and contributed to the crystallization of two emerging political groups: Federalists, who generally supported Washington and Hamilton's policies, and Democratic Republicans, associated with Jefferson and Madison, who opposed them. Washington found the rise of partisan politics deeply troubling. He had hoped that differences of opinion could be managed within a framework of shared commitment to the public good, and that the president could remain above faction. Instead, newspapers and pamphleteers attacked policies and personalities with growing intensity, sometimes criticizing Washington himself. Though he retained immense respect, he felt the strain of governing amid ideological conflict and personal attacks. By the end of his second term, Washington was weary. He believed that remaining too long in office could set a dangerous precedent, and that rotation in leadership was vital for a republic. Declining to run for a third term, he prepared a farewell address to the nation, published in 1796. In this document, Washington offered reflections and warnings. He urged Americans to cherish the Union, cautioning against sectional divisions between North and South or East and West. He warned that political parties, while perhaps inevitable, could become potent engines for mischief if driven by ambition and regional or foreign influence. He advised against permanent alliances and entanglements in European affairs, advocating for a foreign policy based on independent judgment and temporary agreements suited to circumstances. The farewell address was not merely a personal valedictory. It became a foundational text for American political culture. For decades, presidents and citizens cited its counsel on unity, parties, and foreign policy. While later generations debated how closely the country followed his advice, Washington's perspective shaped expectations about the proper stance of the United States in world affairs and the responsibilities of its leaders. Chapter 12. The Last Years of Cincinnatus. Final Retirement, Death, and Legacy. Having completed 2 terms as president, Washington returned once again to Mount Vernon in 1797. This second retirement, like the first, reflected his desire to step away from public burdens and his belief in the importance of civilian life. Yet he did not withdraw entirely from public concerns. He remained in correspondence with political figures, offering advice and comments on current issues, including the growing tensions between the United States and revolutionary France. During the so-called quasi-war with France, an undeclared naval conflict in the late 1790s, President John Adams pressed Washington to accept a nominal role as commander of a provisional army in case of invasion. Washington agreed on the condition that active command in the field would fall to younger officers, reflecting his continued sense of duty and recognition of his age. The crisis subsided without full-scale war, and Washington did not return to active service, but his willingness to be called upon underscored his enduring stature. At Mount Vernon, Washington managed daily operations and continued his agricultural experiments. He also increasingly confronted the moral and practical questions posed by slavery. While he remained a slaveholder throughout his life, he grew uneasy with the institution. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he made provisions in his will to free the enslaved people he directly owned after Martha's death, and he provided for the support of those who were old or infirm. These actions did not erase the fact that he had benefited from slavery for decades, but they indicated an evolving conscience and set a precedent that some later observers found significant. In December 1799, Washington's health took a sudden turn. After riding in cold, wet whether to inspect his property, he developed a severe throat infection. Over the next 2 days, his condition worsened as doctors applied the standard treatments of the time, including repeated bloodletting and other interventions that, by modern standards, likely weakened him further. Despite periods of apparent improvement, he struggled to breathe and speak. On the evening of December 14th, 1799, George Washington died at Mount Vernon, surrounded by a few close associates and enslaved attendants. He remained composed and concerned about the details of his estate and the comfort of those around him until near the end. His last hours, like much of his public life, were marked by dignity and self-control. News of Washington's death traveled quickly and prompted an outpouring of grief and eulogy across the young nation. Memorial services and tributes were held in cities and towns, and public figures compared him to classical Republican heroes such as Cincinnatus, who returned to his plow after serving as dictator of Rome in a time of crisis. Americans mourned not only the man, but also what he symbolized: unity, virtue, and the successful establishment of a republic in a world dominated by monarchies. Over time, Washington's image became central to American civic culture. Paintings, statues, biographies, and stories, some accurate, others embroidered or invented, constructed a national icon. Tales like the cherry tree anecdote, though apocryphal, reinforced ideals of honesty and moral rectitude associated with his name. Schools, towns, and the nation's capital carried his name, embedding him in the geography as well as the memory of the United States. Historians and citizens have continued to reassess Washington, emphasizing different aspects of his life: his leadership and restraint, his role as a slaveholder, his frontier experiences, his cautious yet effective presidency. Yet across debates, certain themes remain. He was a man acutely aware of reputation, driven by duty, and capable of learning from experience. He used power, but he was also willing to relinquish it twice at critical moments. From his youth on Virginia plantations and survey lines, through his trial by fire in imperial wars and revolution, to his shaping of the presidency and final years at Mount Vernon, Washington's life traced the arc of America's transformation, from colony to nation. From an American perspective, his biography is not simply the story of one man, but a lens through which to view the emergence of a new political experiment, with all his contradictions, aspirations, and enduring challenges.